Hello, I'm Barbara. Good afternoon, everyone. It's the utmost pleasure to be given the opportunity to talk about one of the things I'm most passionate about, art. Over the past few years, I have been developing a very particular and keen interest in art history, which I'll admit is a bit weird for someone my age, but nevertheless has been really interesting and particularly amusing to observe the portrayal of certain art styles in media and overall society when you juxtapose it, like you look to it in juxtaposition to the style's actuality when studied through the lens of art history. Sorry. I think Gothic architecture is a perfect example of this because there is a very distinct difference between what we now see as Gothic architecture and what we associated with it to what was originally associated with it. I'll confess, it is one of my favorite styles of architecture to ever exist, but it's still a very fascinating case from a plethora of different perspectives. When we, in contemporary society, hear the word Gothic, we often associate it with death, with darkness, with something that is unsettling, with something that is related to grotesque, to the horror, to terror, with the supernatural, usually vampires, by the way, as well as the sense of barbarity. It is associated with these very dark connections and is immersed in this very Halloween-like field of impressions. This, of course, extends to Gothic architecture. It is seen as something that is dark, with something that is related to death. And there's a very interesting image of gargoyles coming to life and killing people for some reason. Yeah. But nonetheless, it's not really what is Gothic architecture from a sense of art history. It's very away from it. It's very different. Gothic architecture was a style that was initially developed in the 12th century in France, and it very quickly became widespread through Europe, and it perdured until the 16th century. It symbolized a very poignant and important innovation, both technically as well as through symbolically and stylistically. It was developed in a time period, the medieval ages, where everything was controlled by religion. Religion was the motor of society, and because of that, it's no surprise that its main representatives are churches. The Basilica of St. Denis was the first Gothic building, and it was done by this guy. I forgot his name, but he is Abbot Sugar. He basically came up with all the innovations of Gothic architecture, and people just followed and did the same thing elsewhere. The Gothic period in architecture was preceded by the Romanesque style, in Britain also known as Norman. And the Romanesque style is very much so different from the Gothic one. It was mainly inspired by the architectural elements of Christian Rome. And the rounded arch of Christian Rome was the main characteristic of the Romanesque style. In this time period, the main representatives were also churches, because it was done during the medieval ages as well. And it had very thick and heavy walls, because the support of weight was done in buildings. And it had very small and relatively few windows, giving its interior a very dark atmosphere, because there was not enough light coming through. And it had this very fortress-like aesthetic, which is very different from the Gothic one that came afterwards. Gothic architecture brought up a graciousness and lightness unknown to the Romanesque style. Through the discovery of new techniques, they were able to get rid of the thick walls and to allow the entrance of much more light and to build even more higher and taller buildings. Here we have, for example, the Notre Dame in Paris, a very famous building that is in the Gothic style. And it's the subject of some films and some books as well. When compared to its predecessor, it brought up much more light to the interior, which is one of the main characteristics of Gothic style. One of the main also characteristics of Gothic style that allowed for such innovation and for such height in the buildings was the flying buttress. A buttress being a structure that allows the building to support weight. The flying buttress, unlike its predecessor, that was the internal buttress, was an external structure, and therefore it allowed to disperse the weight away from the walls and into an external structure, at the same time pushing back against the outward thrust of the walls, allowing for much more taller buildings. Furthermore, another main characteristic of the Gothic architecture is the rib vault, which was also indispensable to bringing about this increase in size. It was the rib vault, this thing, was also very important to bring about this increase in size, because this method of vaulting by crosswise arches enabled buildings to be much taller and thinner. And it could be, this type of structure could be supported only by slim pillars instead of a whole entire wall, and therefore made the wall between the pillars unnecessary and therefore replaceable by windows, which allowed for the entrance of much more natural light. Additionally, another main characteristic of the Gothic style is the pointed arch, that structurally also allowed to build much taller buildings because it has a more dispersion of weight than the rounded arch. But it also had a very symbolic association. It was associated in the Catholic religion to be pointing towards heaven. The architectural elements and design of Gothic churches and cathedrals also drew a very strong association with religion. This is the stained glass windows, which were also characteristic of Gothic style, and stone tracering, which was another of the main characteristics. And together they made the rose windows, which are also one of the main characteristics of Gothic architecture. And compared to its predecessor, it was a very much more luminous interior than the Romanesque style, and much more ornate than its predecessor, and even its successor, that was the Renaissance era. Gothic architecture grew progressively in complexity through the times it was being done, and in daringness. Its churches and cathedrals are elegant, magnificent, bold, and powerful. The elements also drew a strong connection to religion, as I mentioned before, because church ruled basically everything in society, everything, literally. It was the only kind of education and morality given to the masses. And this is present in the vast majority of elements of Gothic architecture, even the floor plans that were done mostly in the shapes of literal crosses. Much more than that, the soaring heights of Gothic buildings also had a relation to religion. It was believed that the taller your building were, the closer you were to God and to heaven. And this created a sort of competition between people that built churches. They were like, hey, I built a tall church, I'm closer to God than you. And other people are like, just wait and see, I'm going to build a taller one. And there was this competition all throughout Europe. And people were trying to build taller and taller churches for a very big amount of time. The ornaments, likewise, had religious symbolism and functions. The grotesques, which are peculiar sculptures in the shapes of exotic animals and mythical creatures, were one of the main characteristics regarding that. And much of what we now call gargoyles are actually grotesques, and gargoyles are part of grotesque, but not all grotesques are gargoyles. It's a bit confusing. But gargoyles are basically grotesques that also function as a drain spout, so there's water coming out of them. And the function of these elements was not to scare people, it was to scare demons away from the churches and to protect the churches from demons. Yeah, so they were not killing monsters that flew away and killed people. Basically that. The stained glass windows also had a religious function. During this time period, most people didn't have access to an education in writing. Most people didn't know how to write or read. So most of the education was given through speech. And most of the education was given by the church. It was the only form of education available to the masses, and it was the only sense of morality that people got. Church basically told people everything that they knew, and it basically controlled everybody's actions through that. And the stained glass windows had a very particular role in that, because they would be drawn with biblical stories to tell those stories to people, because they could not read them. So it was a way of educating people, but also controlling them. And it's very beautiful as well. And they were used in most of the churches, if not all of them, from the Gothic era. And as a matter of fact, most of Gothic architecture's elements had this function of persuasion towards religion and of controlling people with religion, both objectively and by extension. But overall, the Gothic church on itself had a bit of this function of controlling religion. The magicness, the enormousness of Gothic churches created an ambience, this real experience when you step into one. It is made so that when you step into a Gothic church, you feel so small. And in this context of religion, you feel so small in relation to divinity. And therefore, you're being submissive to religion, and there is this whole connotation and this function that Gothic churches had, whether intentionally or not. There is an author called Gombrich. He wrote The Story of Art, which is one of the main books in art history today. And he said that the faithful who surrendered themselves to the contemplation of all this beauty could feel that they had come nearer to understanding the mysteries of a realm beyond the reach of matter. So when you step into a Gothic church, you feel so small, it's extraordinary. But in this context of religion, you had this thing where you were like, yeah, God exists. Because we're surrounded with vastitude and elements of religion, and had the connotation. In creating this spiritual transport and to a divine realm, which was the objective of the guy that basically created Gothic architecture and its successors and the people who did all of that, they had an objective of transporting people to a divine realm. And there was one particular element that was perhaps more important than others, perhaps not, and it was light. Light was one of the main things that they had in Gothic architecture. This is because in the time period that was primarily theological, light also was seen as a key to activating a materials object's capability of connecting to God. So they believed that if light hit something that was inanimate in a certain way, this thing could connect to God and to a divine realm. It's a very weird thing, but it made sense to them. Other than that, they also believed that light was also from a divine realm. It was not from our realm. It was from heaven or whatever. But there was this connotation of light being something heavenly and something that could bring religion transportation to a divine realm. And so it was very used in Gothic architectures because they discovered that technology to let a bunch of light in. And the objective was not only to flood Gothic churches with light, but to also harness in a particular way. There was an intention to harness Gothic light in a way that you guided the viewer's sight to a higher plane, to the ceiling or something. And in a symbolistic view, you guided the viewer's sight to a divine plane, to a higher plane. So it had a connotation as well. They had this function. And light was one of the most important characteristics of Gothic architecture at this historical view. Having said all that, you might ask me, but how did Gothic churches go from being associated with light to being associated with darkness? Well, it's a relatively complex answer, but I think we can pinpoint three main things. The Renaissance, that came directly after the Gothic era, Gothic literature, and the Victorian residential architecture that is widely in pop culture today, and it has a particular association with darkness. So the Gothic style and time period it was inserted in was followed by the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was a very rationalized time period that valued science and knowledge in detriment of religion. This time period and movement, this time period had a valuing movement of valuing Greece and Rome. They valued very much the classical civilizations, sort of as an ideal to uphold. They wanted to bring back the epitome that was Greece and Rome. And in doing so, they had a very negative view of the medieval ages, which they denominated the Dark Ages, which they saw not only as a stagnant time in the development of society overall and science, in a time of calamity and tragedy because of the Black Plague and everything, but they also viewed the medieval ages as sort of a villain for ending the greatness that was classical civilization in their eyes. And this, of course, was seen in art and architecture, this valuing of Greek and Roman elements and a detriment to the Gothic period and a negative view of the Gothic period that became associated with barbarity. The term Gothic was coined during the Renaissance, and it was the doing of one person called Giorgio Vasari, who was an Italian painter and artist, and his works are considered to be the basis of modern art historical study. And the name had an intentional derogatory connotation. It was intentional for it to be negative. It was an attempt to link the style with the Goths, barbarics, in the sense of barbarics to Rome, who had invaded Rome, and in the view of the Renaissance had destroyed classical civilization. So there was this intention of associating this architectural movement, the Gothic one, to that destruction of ancient Greek and Roman values and art. During the 18th century, we see the rise of what is called the Gothic novel, which was a strain of Romanticism in literature, and was mainly characterized by an atmosphere of horror and mystery in a pseudo-medieval setting. Being in a pseudo-medieval setting, Gothic architecture played a big part of the ambience. And particularly, authors of Gothic novels, such as Horace Walpole, who was a pioneer in the genre with his book, The Castle of Otranto, and Radcliffe and Bram Stoker, the author of the now so famous Dracula, and never so famous Dracula, had a tendency of setting those novels around decaying Gothic buildings. So buildings that were had seen the passage of time, to put it lightly, and were falling down to pieces. That was the ambience that we have in these novels that were associated with horror. And so because these novels had such immense popularity and still play a huge part in contemporary imagery, we often associate Gothic architecture with these elements, and Gothic novels are certainly a big part why we now have this association. The Association of Gothic Revival Buildings, the Association of Gothic Revival Buildings, which the Victorian is a part of, with other elements of horror and Halloween and stuff like that, also played a big part in this association. Victoria mentions during the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, in the United States, became associated with bad things. We can give that to popular culture at the time, as well as because with the Great Depression, Victorian buildings were abandoned and were being decayed, and it became a very common sight in the United States of abandoned Victorian buildings, and people started creating horror stories around that. But also because one thing in particular, the Addams Family, which started out as a cartoon, but it associated this family that is very much so connected to horror and the macabre with a Victorian house. And this was followed in a huge amount of popular culture and media, like a movie by Hitchcock and a lot of other things. So we have this association of Gothic architecture and its related styles to horror because of those movements throughout history. That it's how one thing can be seen dramatically differently from when looked from a vastitude of perspectives. I hope that I made you at least a bit curious to ask why a certain stereotype is portrayed, why you have a certain image of something, and what image did this thing have throughout history. Thank you.